مردم شریف ایران، من شهریار افشار هستم. امروز مجددا آقای اسکات وینر به برنامه پیوسته. ایشون یک محقق هستش، یه ریسرچر در the US International Commission for International Religious Freedom یا کمیسیون آمریکا در امور آزادی مذهبی بین‌المللی. این مؤسسه غیرانتفاعی هر سال یه ریپورت جدید صادر میکنه که خب به دست سیاستمدارا و کنگره میرسه و مخصوصا با توجه به حوادثی که این سال اخیر متاسفانه شاهدش شدیم، هم در غزه، هم در ایران، هم در کشورهای خاورمیانه. میخواستیم حتما مزاحم اسکات بشیم مجددا که درباره ریپورت و کارهایی که مؤسسه ایشون میکنه به نظر شما برسونیم. بقیه برنامه به انگلیسیه. Scott, welcome back. Thanks so much for making more time. Such an important topic. You know, I know at the core of every Iranian diaspora abroad, many Iranians in Iran, maybe a great majority, religious freedom is who we are. I mean, we truly believe it. No one has anything against Islam or Judaism or any other religion as far as Iranians to the core are concerned. They value religious diversity. And I think they feel that your work is very important in confronting and holding governments accountable and reporting on our religious freedom or any oppression that goes on around the world. So I really wanted to come back, to you and hear from your report, not only about Iran and the Middle East, but of course, especially about some of the press statements you've made about Gaza. Another troubling area, and unfortunately something we have to witness every day. No one wants a loss of life, but certainly when you look at what happened October 7, undeniable terrorist attack on the good, peace-loving community that was we witnessed, but also what's been happening since then in Gaza. So having said that, if you could give us a quick primer about the commission and its core mission, and then we'll get into your report. Thanks so much for joining us.
Sure. Well, Shab Bekhair, thank you so much for having me back again. It's great to see you and to speak with you and your audience. So USERF, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, was created by Congress in 1998 with the mission of elevating religious freedom as a norm and practice. We are comprised of 9 bipartisan commissioners who were appointed by the President of the United States and the majority and minority leadership of the House of Representatives and Senate. And this bipartisan group of commissioners works together. It's a rare thing in Washington, but works together in a bipartisan way to monitor and report on religious freedom around the world. So we don't cover US domestic policy, but we look around the world and really identify some of the worst violators. I'm a member of our staff of about 18 that assist our commissioners with some of that work. So in our 2024 annual report, which was just released, we identify several of these countries. 17 we recommend to the State Department for designation as a country of particular concern, which is sort of our most concerning category, and then 11 we've recommended for special watch list, which is slightly lower but still very problematic.
Right. So amazing, such an important work, and like you say, bipartisanship is not really what Washington is known for, but some things I think transcend that, and I think religious freedom is, I hope, one of those things. So take us through those 7, if you could, just the highlights of that report, and maybe list, if you could, what countries were recommended to the State Department as areas of concern, if you could.
Sure. So we align with the State Department on several of these countries, and I think you probably won't be surprised by what they are. So Burma, China, Cuba, Eritrea, Iran, Nicaragua, North Korea, Pakistan, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. In addition to those countries where we align with the State Department, we recommend 5 additional countries: Afghanistan, Azerbaijan, India, Nicaragua, and Vietnam. USERF is a legislative branch agency, so we sort of act as an independent watchdog for the administration, and we can make recommendations and call out the administration, regardless of which party happens to hold the White House at any given time, and push them to be doing more to advance freedom of religion or belief. So in Nicaragua, or excuse me, in Nigeria, for example, we've seen really concerning trends regarding freedom of religion or belief. There are blasphemy laws in place. There's been violence that's been religious in nature, directed at members of the Christian community, in some cases Muslims as well, non-believers and atheists. And so for us, that seems very clearly to meet the criterion of a country which exhibits systematic, ongoing, and egregious religious freedom violations. But the State Department hasn't designated Nigeria as a country, so as a country of particular concern. So we continue to advocate for that. Where we have alignment, as I mentioned, isn't particularly surprising, but we continue to see the Russian government crack down on religious minorities, both within Russia and then also in Ukraine as part of its ongoing invasion there. And of course, China has really brutally repressed members of the Uyghur and other Turkic minority Muslim communities there. And we've heard all kinds of horror stories about re-education camps and really, really serious violations of freedom of religion or belief. So we try to report using a full range of sources on what exactly is going on. We use that to inform policymakers. We also inform the public. We hold hearings, and we conduct travel to countries where we're able to go to really make sure that we're providing the most accurate and updated information possible to policymakers who are seeking to advance freedom of religion or belief.
Right. And so as these reports are produced and they're recommended to the State Department obviously may, like you say, sometimes you're aligned, sometimes you're not. They make calculations based on diplomatic relations and what have you, I assume, and kind of decide what to do. Do some of these recommendations lead to what, more sanctions, or what are the actions that state may take based on your recommendations?
Sure. So we actually have an entire section about this in our annual report. So sometimes it's sanctions, other times it can be working collaboratively with governments that are so inclined. And sometimes it's making sure that there's international pressure and trying to coordinate like-minded governments for action. So one example of this with regards to sanctions actually relates to Iran. For a couple of years, USERF has recommended that the Treasury expand and clarify some of the specific sanctions waivers that allow Iranians access to critical technology that allows them to organize protest activity, which has had a very strong religious freedom component. And we were really pleased to see that just last week, the Treasury did in fact make this adjustment to its sanctions waiver policy. So it's these kinds of things that sort of open the space for that assistive technology to make it into Iran, where people who are on the ground, who are really fighting the fight day to day, are able to have every possible advantage in order to advance freedom of religion or belief.
Right. And, because I speak to a lot of human rights activists on this program, and now here I am speaking to a religious freedom expert, there's a lot of alignment right there. So I could see a lot of human rights activists wanting the same technology or waivers granted so people on the ground can document human rights violations as well, right? So there's a lot of there's an old saying in Iran, that both of our waters are going into one stream in this case, right? So do you work a lot with human rights organizations, or do you kind of keep separate?
Yes, so USERF's monitoring is according to international legal standards. So we're not looking at the First Amendment of the US Constitution. We're looking at mostly Article 18 of the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So we see religious freedom or freedom of religion or belief is really at the core of a lot of other human rights, because fundamentally human rights are about protection of individual people and the right to your own thoughts, the rights to your own beliefs and to manifest those through teaching, practice, worship, and observance are so core to the human experience. So we work extensively with human rights groups, international groups like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and also many country focus groups. So we have a really productive relationship with a number of groups within the Iranian American diaspora, within Iranian NGOs that are based in Europe. And so we've been really lucky to enjoy those really strong relationships where we're able to reach out if we have questions and they're able to provide us with information. So these are the kinds of relationships that we have with civil society that are extremely valuable for us and really help with ensuring that our reporting is as accurate and updated as impactful as possible.
Nice. Two questions, then we'll get to Gaza in a minute, but how has this report been received by the international community? Not the 17 countries of concern, but the larger, maybe the UN or other global organizations.
Sure. So, we maintain relationships with some of those organizations and like to hear kind of what they're focused on, what some of their priorities are. We know that several countries have tried in certain ways to replicate this report for their own governments. There's an international alliance that is sort of hosted through the US State Department called the International Religious Freedom or Belief Alliance. And it's a number of different member states that all commit to advancing religious freedom. And so these are like-minded governments. They issue joint statements on issues of concern, including Baha'is in Iran last year, and some of the repression that community has faced. And so a lot of these individual governments have tried to put together similar reports or make similar kinds of designations. And so what's emerged is really this ecosystem of protectors of freedom of religion or belief. And so that's really valuable from the point of view of the US government, because it's one thing when it's just the United States that's making a point. But when we're able to lead an international coalition of countries that all have different equities and all have different interests, and everybody is aligned on this fundamental issue of freedom and fundamental human freedom, then it really makes a powerful statement. And we find that that's a really effective way to make the case for freedom of religion or belief.
Always better safety in numbers.
Exactly.
Do you find other, whether they're US allies or not, other countries echoing some of these concerns? Let's say, for example, on Iran. It's no secret, religious oppression, human rights, but it's not a big secret. Do other countries kind of take the US report and kind of run with it and kind of take their own actions, sanctions or any actions from other governments against repression, let's say in Iran?
Sure. So over the past year, we've actually seen a number of sanctions actions that have been coordinated between the United States and, for example, the United Kingdom, but other governments as well. So we know that there's alignment between the US and other governments on some of these specific issues. And in general, we found that working in multilateral fora like the UN Human Rights Council or even the UN General Assembly has been an effective way to try and make the case. Obviously, the US and Iran have a multi-decade long history of animosity for all kinds of reasons. But when it's countries that sit outside of that conflict that are making the exact same point, it helps drive home that this is really about something much more fundamental than just sort of the normal back and forth between the two countries. And so that sends a really powerful message. So we do see countries using USCIRF's reporting and working closely with the US government to coordinate multilateral action. You saw the formation of a special organization to investigate the protests that emerged in September 2022 in Iran and were really brutally repressed by the government. So this fact-finding mission recently concluded that it was very likely that crimes against humanity have been committed in Iran. USCIRF was one of the first US government organizations to call for the creation of this kind of independent international body, both because we think accountability for these kinds of religious freedom violations is really critical, but also because having that multilateral coalition to make the point really magnifies the impact that it can have in terms of providing for the Iranian people the kind of accountability they deserve after being so brutally repressed by security forces, by members of the police, by prison guards, interrogators, etc. So we want to send home the message that this is something that not just the US, but really the entire international community is watching and aware of and documenting very closely.
Has Iran responded in any way to these reports? Any official statements?
So in the past, they have, not in the past in the past couple of years, but we know in the past they have. We have some indications that when we and civil society actors and other governments raise critical cases, that can sometimes be helpful. There can be really egregious sentences that are made a little bit less egregious, or sentences that can be postponed. So we always try to make the effort to do that whenever we think we can have an impact. But we do have evidence to suggest that this kind of advocacy is effective and that it does influence the safety and the well-being of people on the ground in Iran.
Right. So even if they don't admit it, it definitely, you feel they definitely notice it, they're aware of it, they're to the extent that they can not create more attention to themselves, they may actually act on it by potentially postponing or deferring any executions or any individual actions in countries. Have you found that to be the case at all?
I think generally we find that advocacy on many of these cases is really effective. And again, to shine the spotlight of the attention of the US government is a really powerful tool. And so we encourage the administration to do that to the fullest extent possible. We have literal lives on the line in so many of these cases. And so we want to do everything we can to try and protect them.
Thank you. Thank you. That's so important. Now, in a couple of minutes we have left, let's turn to Gaza and what's been happening there. Like I said, and we've talked with many people. I've talked with folks in Palestine on this program, Arab activists, Jewish activists. I always say I'm nonpartisan. I don't really have a dog in this race, as I say, but of course, we're all human beings. And when October 7 happened, I feel like that was the 9/11 for Israel in many ways. It was very heart-wrenching, it was very difficult to witness those atrocities, terrorist attack by Hamas. But then what's been happening since October 8th is even more troubling. We're not creating any equivalencies between Hamas leadership and Israeli leaderships, but the International Criminal Court just issued these arrest warrants, which some people it's caused a lot of confusion and a lot of reaction from everybody. However, what's been happening inside Gaza, especially with religious structures, which are, of course, very important and sacred to the Palestinian people. I understand the commission has issued some statements in that regard. What is the commission's position on what's been happening in Gaza in that regard?
So I think there's two specific ways that the commission has reacted to the conflict. Largely, this is a conflict between different national groups as opposed to religious groups. But of course, when we're talking about the Holy Land, religion plays a role. So the first issue is the spike that we've seen globally in anti-Semitic attacks, not just attacks on sites that have relevance for Israel, but on Jewish sites, on synagogues in Tunisia that have been burned down, the tagging of Jewish homes in Europe, targeting of Jewish day schools. So just very explicitly anti-Semitic acts of violence. And we've also seen a rise in anti-Muslim hatred as well, attacks and threats on mosques, on people who have nothing to do with Hamas, on people who have nothing to do with the violence that we saw on October 7th. And so we're sort of tracking both that, the rise of threats against people who are exercising their freedom of religion or belief, and also the ways in which governments are responding. Governments have obligations to ensure freedom of religion or belief, but sometimes they'll just start to ban speech outright. And there's countries that have blasphemy laws, for example. So what we want to do is really provide the toolbox for governments to address anti-Semitism, to address anti-Muslim bias, but to do it within the confines of international law and to not ban speech overall, even if that speech is hateful or offensive. So that's sort of one of the trends that we're really closely monitoring. With regards to the situation in the region, we've put out some statements around religious incitement, which unfortunately we've seen to a concerning extent. And just last week, we put out at the beginning of of May a piece on the laws of war and protections under international humanitarian law for houses of worship. So these are sites that are protected because they have special significance. They're often cultural sites. They're sites where people will often go to seek refuge. And so there are principles within international humanitarian law that protect these sites, even if the enemy is not necessarily respectful of the sacred nature of a lot of these sites. There are still principles like proportionality and precaution and distinction that guide the ways in which governments are obligated to respond. Unfortunately, we see a lot of war right now globally, and so we look at cases like Burma. We've seen really incredible violence in Sudan, in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Nigeria, and of course in Israel and Gaza as well, where houses of worship have been destroyed or damaged as the result of conflict. So when we see Hamas shooting rockets that can't be guided, and one of them hits a synagogue in Ashdod, inherently there's no way that you can take any precaution to prevent that from happening if you can't aim the rocket. And then on the flip side, we've seen attacks on mosques in Gaza. We've seen attacks that have hit churches, that have destroyed buildings and killed people. The St. Porphyrius Church in Gaza, which is reportedly the third oldest church in the world, among those. So understanding that war obviously has human costs, and that's kind of where most of the discussion is now, which makes sense from a human rights perspective. And on top of that, there are protections under international law for houses of worship. And for many of these international laws, it's not just like it would kind of be nice if governments didn't. It says governments need to take, quote, all feasible measures to prevent damage or destruction of these sites. So it is really a high bar and not something that we should take for granted when we're talking about the full scope of destruction that can happen in an armed conflict, whether that's in Israel or Gaza or anywhere else in the world.
Thank you, Scott Wiener from the U.S. Commission for International Religious Freedom, Comisión آمریکا در امور آزادی مذهبی بین‌المللی. Thank you for sharing all your insights, all your work that you're doing. Please keep it up. Please keep going. Please keep reporting. Please keep holding all of these events and atrocities to account so we can all hopefully live in a better world. Thanks again for joining us.
Hey, Mamnoon, thank you so much.